Welcome to the July 5th, 2020 online worship service at the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. I'm Rebecca Howard, Worship Associate. Our minister, the Reverend John Cullinan, is taking some well-deserved time off to rest and recharge, as well as do some planning for the coming months. Today, I'm delighted to welcome our guest minister, the Reverend Jean Siegfried Darling. Reverend Darling was born into a skeptical, scientific, politically active Unitarian Universalist household. She passed through careers in computer science and television production and came to ministry late. Reverend Jean formed the New Garden Community UU Church in Chicago and then served People's Church in Chicago for about 10 years before moving to the Santa Fe area with her husband Ken. She is active in the UU Santa Fe Church, co-chairing the Environmental Justice Team and leading the Occasional Choir. Welcome, Reverend Darling.
Our chalice lighting this morning are words from Mark Bellentini. In heaven. It's true. When our ancestors spoke of heaven, they were speaking of this moment. When they went on about nirvana, they imagined a time like this. When they sang of paradise, it was this morning they imagined. A time when all the mysteries of life and death are blended in a community of praise. When the bones of ancient lovers are given flesh again in our own bodies. Teachers of long ago speaking of love and truth, once more in lives so ordinary they are extraordinary. Blessed is our breath, in and out, quiet. Blessed is our sitting, our fidgeting, our movement. Blessed is our heartbeat, echoing the pounding alleluias of the distant stars. Blessed is the silence that is presence, not absence.
Welcome again to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. As Unitarian Universalists, we affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person and support a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Whoever you are, whomever you love, wherever you are on your life's journey, you are welcome here. I'd like to extend a special welcome to anyone joining us for the first time. To learn more about our church, as well as opportunities to connect during the week, check our website, our Facebook page, and sign up for our email announcements. You can also contact Reverend Cullinan directly via email. His address is in the service notes below. If you're watching on Sunday morning, we invite you to join our Zoom coffee hour after the service at 11. The information for that was sent out in our email announcement and is on our Facebook page. Whether you are visiting us for the first time or have been part of this congregation for years, may this time we set apart from our everyday concerns help us to see what is most important to us in ourselves, in each other, and in the world around us. We begin with a moment of shared silence. Each week brings joy and sorrow into our lives. We may come here today with our hearts soaring with joy or our hearts heavy with sorrow. The moving away of a beloved friend or a baby bird who fell too soon from its nest. Or the chaos and confusion of the events in the world may weigh heavily on us and bring a sense of sorrow. We may also come with joy at the birth of a new baby, or reconnecting with a friend with whom we had lost touch, or perhaps the blooming of flowers in our garden or in the forest may all bring us joy. Let us take a moment now as 2 candles burn in our sanctuary to bring to our minds and hearts the sorrows and the joys that we carry with us, whether shared aloud or held quietly and tenderly within.
I invite you to close your eyes and to breathe deeply a couple of times. And let go of those things that have been nagging you, that distress you, that make you angry. Breathe deeply and be in touch with the sound of your breath, the feel of the air passing through your nostrils. And notice how your chest rises and falls slowly. We've been going through some hard times, and we don't always get to see or be with the people we love. We miss their touch, perhaps the sound of their voice. Many things have been happening, some good, some bad, some encouraging, some frightening. Thich Nhat Hanh reminds us that even when we feel sad, we can still smile. We are not made up only of sadness. Even if we are afraid, we are not only afraid. We can still smile. And there are parts of us that love and feel compassion and feel joy at times. Let us nurture those parts that comfort ourselves. Let us smile, a tiny smile, and feel our face relax. There. Whenever things begin to feel like too much, let us smile, a gentle little smile.
Hey guys! So today our story is called The Magic Bean Crisis, written by Katharine Childs, the Director of Religious Education at the Unitarian Church of Montreal in Canada. And this is the story of the Magic Bean Crisis. Our story takes place in a magical kingdom, which is not so very far away. It takes place not very long ago. This was a magical kingdom in which strange things were known to happen, but the people more or less were used to dealing with them. After a rash of apple poisonings, the orchard was quickly decontaminated. When houses made of sticks were widely identified as being vulnerable to blowing down, the community rallied to rebuild stone houses for the residents. Yes, this kingdom was very, very good at getting back to normal whenever anything went wrong. That is, until the Magic Bean Crisis. One spring, you see, instead of a single enormous beanstalk that more than provided enough nutritious veggies for the kingdom, well, no one knows exactly what happened, but one morning the kingdom woke up to find that they had been completely overrun with beanstalks. Beanstalks had taken over the royal gardens, the town square, and charming organic meadow. They were growing up through the floor of the spinning wheel factory and the huntsman's axe sharpening kiosk. The queen and her royal advisors pondered the issue. There was no way to remove that many beanstalks. They would just have to wait until the stalks receded. The people would have enough to eat. There was, after all, a nutritious food source surrounding their homes. But they would just have to stay put for a while. And so they did. They waited and waited and waited. And eventually, the stalks did recede. But I don't know if you know what happens to a building when a vine has attached itself to the outside for a long time. You might think that rocks are a pretty solid building material. Third Pig Construction has staked their reputation on it. But it turns out that there are two things that are very good at breaking down rocks. And it's water and beanstalks. So, when everyone emerged from their homes, the queen realized that there wasn't going to be the easy going back to normal that the kingdom had always been so good at. There would need to be rebuilding of homes and gardens, but also of wishing wells, and not to mention the spinning wheel factory and the knight's armory, which were both in shambles. So the queen called a great conference with all of the beings in the kingdom, witches, wizards, fairy godmothers, and all matter of talking frogs, and cats with impressive wardrobes. She asked each of them to imagine how they might rebuild the kingdom and make everything be exactly the way it was before. There was silence until one of the fairy godmothers said, "But what if we didn't?" The queen looked shocked. "Whatever do you mean?" she asked. "Well, what if we didn't put everything back to exactly the way it was. What if we made it better? The fairy godmother replied. The crowd gasped, and there was a pause before the excited shouting started from the kingdom's populace. Well, what if the spinning wheel factory could run on a windmill instead of burning coal, said somebody. Well, what if we built a fence around the sheep grazing hill so that Bo didn't have to spend so much time chasing them? What if there was a bicycle trail that went through the town square instead of out past all the houses so we could bicycle into town to do our shopping? Well, what if the morning bells weren't quite as loud, suggested one particularly bleary-eyed monk named Jock. Sir Bluster, the bravest knight in the kingdom, he trademarked that himself, stood up in front of the assembly and spoke. Well, these ideas all sound very nice, but obviously the most important thing is to rebuild the knight's armory. How else are we going to defend the kingdom? He sat down, feeling that no other argument was necessary. Obviously, he and his fellow knights had the most important job in the kingdom. Then there came a very small voice from somewhere in the crowd. From what? No one knew where the voice was coming from. No one knew what to say. Everyone was silent. The voice came again. Defend us from what? Sir Bluster, blustered. No one had ever dared to challenge him before. Why, from dragons, of course, he muttered, not leaving his seat. A great buzzing took over the room. If there was one thing that everyone in the kingdom was afraid of, it was dragons. Seeing everyone getting so anxious, the queen called for quiet, peering between her citizens to see if she could see where the small voice was coming from. The voice came again. Have you ever seen a dragon? This time, the buzzing that filled the room wasn't quite so anxious. A few people realized that, no, they had never actually seen a dragon. Sir Bluster shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Of course none of them have seen a dragon. My knights keep the kingdom well protected, he asserted. Now another voice spoke up. Well, if none of us has ever seen a dragon, how do we know they're actually a threat to the kingdom? Sir Bluster was looking very uncomfortable indeed. My knights and I go to the dragon lands all the time. We keep you safe by keeping those dragons out. This conversation was really getting out of hand. The queen raised her hand again to call for quiet. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about these dragons, Sir Bluster, she asked. Sir Bluster mumbled before standing up to address the crowd, gathering his words. Dragons, yes. Very scary. Very big. Huge. They fly and breathe fire. So very scary. You should all be very glad that the knights and I keep you all so safe. A loud rumble moved through the crowd. Yes, dragons were very scary. Sir Bluster must be correct. And then, one by one, the crowd fell silent, as the owner of that first small voice rose out of the crowd. One shiny, delicate, pink and green-winged dragon, no bigger than the cat with the fabulous wardrobe, flew up to the perch on the back of the queen's chair. This time, the voice was not small and shy, but loud, and as the dragon roared the word "No!" a streak of flame shot from her mouth. She settled back down and spoke loudly now. Every time there is a crisis in this kingdom, you all work your very hardest to get back to normal as quickly as you can, rebuilding homes and rooting out poison apples. But have you ever spared one moment, one load of rebuilding materials, one squad of gnomes to help the dragons? No. Instead, you send in Sir Bluster and his men to terrorize us. We have homes just like you. We have families and children just like you. But while your homes and gardens were destroyed by the beanstalk vines, it was our eggs, our babies, who were destroyed. We came here today to ask to plead for your help, but instead Sir Bluster here wants you to rebuild his armory so that you can come and throw spears at us while we are just trying to rebuild our homes and our barbecue restaurants. We mean you no harm. We're just different than you. Yet instead of coming and sharing a meal with us, you would rather feel safe just because Sir Bluster tells you we're dangerous, and he's taken care of it. The witches especially looked very embarrassed. They certainly knew what the dragons were talking about. It wasn't too long ago that people in the kingdom had been convinced that the witches were scary and the knights wanted them to be pushed out into the forest. They nodded to one another. "The witches stand by the dragons," one shouted. "And so do the gnomes," came a chorus of squeaky voices. "Third pig construction will help rebuild the Dragonlands." The queen nodded and held up her hand for silence. "The rebuilding of our new and improved fairy tale kingdom will begin at once with the rebuilding of the Dragon's Barbecue restaurant, even though I'm not really sure what that is. It will proceed with the conversion of the spinning wheel factory to a sustainable energy model. The last thing to be rebuilt will be the King's Knight's Armory. Maybe. For as long as the rebuilding efforts are underway, all spears will be recrafted into pruning tools for the orchard, and all swords will be remade into farming equipment." She turned to Sir Bluster and the knights. "My brave knights, now that I have met these dragons, I'm not certain that you have been living up to your knightly vows. A knight's job is to first serve and then defend. I believe you will all learn much by getting out of that armor and helping your fellow citizens rebuild." And that is the story of how barbecue became the most popular takeout food in all of the kingdom, and how Sir Bluster discovered he really did actually enjoy farming, and how everyone else lived happily ever after, for now, anyways. And for our intention table activity, you can draw or write about the community that you want to make better and how you want to make better your community that you live in. Maybe you want to put in a windmill like they were talking about for energy. And so you can create this and draw and write about the community you dream of. We did this in Family Chapel one Sunday, and you can keep working on this with your family and keep dreaming. And that's our time for all ages. See you next time.
We have two readings this morning. The first is from Walter Brueggmann, from his book, The Prophetic Imagination. The prophet engages in futuring, fantasy. The prophet does not ask if the vision can be implemented, for questions of implementation are of no consequence until the vision can be imagined. The imagination must come before the implementation. Our culture is competent to implement almost anything and to imagine almost nothing. The same royal consciousness that make it possible to implement anything and everything is the one that shrinks imagination, because imagination is a danger. Thus, every totalitarian regime is frightened of the artist. It is the vocation of the prophet to keep alive the ministry of imagination, to keep on conjuring and proposing futures alternative to the single one the king wants to urge as the only thinkable one. The second reading is from Frederick Douglass, from our own hymnal, number 579, The Limits of Tyrants. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are people who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be both, a moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out what people will submit to, and you have found out the exact amount of injustice which will be imposed upon them. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. This is what democracy looks like. Democracy in radical imagination. Anyone who, like me, has taken part in demonstrations over the past decades for racial or gender justice, for women's equality, for peace, for the 99%, knows the chant, "This is what democracy looks like." A bunch of people with signs, banners, sometimes giant puppets, walking through the streets, blocking traffic. Or maybe you've been in one of the cars held up by such a crowd. But it begs the question, what does democracy look like? Perhaps you remember a couple of years ago, they asked people in England to name a new polar research vessel via crowdsourcing. The most votes came in for Boaty McBoatface. I have to admit, every time I hear that silly name, it makes me laugh. But some people say that it just proves that people are too stupid to be trusted with governing. And surely you've heard what Winston Churchill famously said. It has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. You might like to know that in the end the ship was named after Sir David Attenborough instead. But the name Boaty McBoatface was bestowed on one of its deep-sea diving pods. We humans have struggled with the idea of how to rule ourselves for millennia. For example, one of my favorite bits from the Hebrew Bible, when Samuel is considering his succession. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow in your ways. Appoint for us then a king to govern us like other nations." Well, Samuel doesn't like this, and he consults with God, who tells him to tell the people like it is. "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest and to make the implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." But did they listen? No, since apparently we have a built-in yearning for leaders. And some people have a yearning to be the one who decides, even if they have none of the skills or knowledge to do so. Dave Meslin, a community organizer and general troublemaker in Canada, writes in his book, Tear Down, Rebuilding Democracy from the Ground Up. He writes about the trajectory of democratic impulses in British history. He begins with the Magna Carta, 1215, in which the nobility forced the tyrannical King John to yield some of his power to them. Then came the idea of Parliament, from the French parler, to talk, where governing came from people, nobles at first, talking together. And finally, the Commons, many hundreds of years later. And since 1902, the convention is that the Prime Minister must have a seat in the House of Commons and not the House of Lords. Meslin speaks of the shape of power. Pointy, in the case of a single head of state with great power, and rounded as more people are involved in decision-making. When our founding fathers were arguing over what shape our government should be, they were very concerned about concentrated power in the hands of an executive. They did not want to replicate the kingship in this new country. A number of states also had the experience of dictatorial excesses of British governors of the colonies, and in their state constitutions, they outlawed veto power for their state governors in response. Both these impulses in human culture, to want and admire a leader like the elders of Israel demanding a king, like the other nations, and to distrust just such an institution, are displayed in this quotation, perhaps from a novel of Henry Adams, who descended from the political Adams family. And there she stood with her eyes fixed on the president and his wife, while the endless stream of humanity passed them, shaking hands. And in all that crowd, there was no one besides herself who felt the mockery of this exhibition. They thought it was a democratic institution, this droll aping of monarchical forms. Meslin points out how we Western democracies have been moving back toward pointier governance lately. He includes a diagram that shows the trajectory over time with rounded power, which starts out low, rises, and then reaching its peak around 1800, and then gradually losing out again to pointy power, where pointy power starts rising again in the early part of the 20th century. In his book, he gives us plenty of suggestions for returning to a more rounded kind of power, a more democratic kind of power. I know that many of us are feeling anxious these days, not only because of COVID, but also for the future of our democracy. One of the effects of the movement for Black Lives demonstrations here in the United States has been to spark similar demonstrations all around the world. And it's not only the hypocrisy that people are responding to. You know, we talk about freedom. Do we honor it? But I think what people are responding to is the desire for us Americans to live up to the ideals of our country that it seems to embody for people everywhere. To me, that is very hopeful. In spite of all the damage to our democratic institutions, the current administration has wreaked. And besides our admiration of powerful individuals, what is getting in the way of our returning to a more rounded kind of power? Several things come to mind. Lack of practice, for one. How many places do we get to practice our own kind of parliament, where we talk together to solve a common problem? Our UU congregations are one example. Can you think of any others? There seems to be a distrust of other people's intelligence or judgment. Look at Bodie Boatface, though perhaps that was more cynicism than stupidity. We in our church, we trust one another, but then we know each other. Another quotation on a more positive note from Abraham Lincoln. I am a firm believer in the people. If given the truth, they can be depended upon to meet any national crisis. The great point is to bring them the real facts and beer. That is not cynical. It's funny. Lincoln also said, more seriously, "As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master." This expresses my idea of democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. I think that trusting others is a matter of choice, a matter of faith. If we truly say we believe in the democratic process, as our statement of principles puts it, then we really need to trust it and trust that other humans have the same needs and sense of responsibility that we do. Meslin talks about an experiment in democratic decision-making that started in British Columbia. People were randomly selected to take part in a citizens' assembly on electoral reform, with attention paid to geographic, economic, and cultural diversity. Their work, in 4 stages, stretched over 11 months. They learned from experts. They held public consultations with ordinary citizens as well as interest groups, and then debated the options. After voting on various proposals, they delivered a detailed recommendation for a proportional voting system. I like that. Unfortunately, I looked it up, and the population of British Columbia voted against it, alas. They should have all gone through that process. Another obstacle to real democracy is the vast inequality in our nation. I think that the gulfs between people with money and people without it are so vast that they are unbridgeable. If you happened to log in to the June 20th Poor People's virtual March on Washington with Reverend William Barber, you'd have heard the flight attendant who works for one of the small airlines contracted by the large ones to fly the small routes not on the major hubs. They make half what regular flight attendants make. They often have to have a second job. The pilots are said to be on food stamps to make ends meet. I think we need to be thinking about what essential services must be provided by the government and not by the market, which is not interested in unprofitable ventures. Infrastructure, of course, education, obviously, but what about healthcare? What about public transportation? What about libraries, energy, the post office? What about a state bank for New Mexico to keep its money in and invest it in this state and reap its own dividends? For people to feel equal, they need to not have to beg for the essentials of life. I loved Andrew Yang's idea of universal basic income, which he dubbed the freedom dividend. To pay every adult citizen in the U.S., he came up with 252 million people, $1,000 a month would cost, he calculated, $2.8 trillion for the year. Sounds like a lot of money. But most of it would go right back into the economy. During the first months of the pandemic, 45.5 million Americans filed for unemployment. But according to Forbes data, between March 18th and June 17th, those first 3 months, the net worth of the 640 plus U.S. billionaires jumped from $2.9 trillion to $3.5 trillion. Think of that. The billionaires alone could cover an entire year of the freedom dividend and have $731 billion left over. So, we've taken care of inequality, or at least the suffering of those at the bottom of the economic ladder. What else do we need for democracy to flourish? I think we need more free time. We've been living lives that are far too structured, until recently, that is. And parents now are learning that their children, since they've been staying home from school, are developing interests they never evinced before. In a story by Lenore Skenazy, perhaps you know her writing, she talked about one boy who took a kite outside to fly it. He had never done that before. Another decided he wanted to build a computer. A girl began to clean her room, which had always been a complete disaster. If it weren't for the people who are truly in dire straits and being evicted, or worried about having no health care, or enough to eat, this time of lockdown would be a little like entering retirement. At first you pace, you can't figure out what to do with yourself, and little by little, some door in the back of your mind that had been firmly shut begins to creak open, and things you wanted to do a long time ago remind you of themselves, and you are re-enlivened. Think of what the world could be like if all this pent-up creativity and energy were available for us to make this world a better place. We need more compassion and the tools to put compassion to work. We need more trust in one another, and we need to start talking. We need the time to talk, to fix the things that are broken, to comfort and cheer one another. Let us remember the dream our forebears grew into a country out of nothing but their imaginations. Let us begin to renew our life together as a people. Let us dream this new world into being. May it be so.
Here in this religious community, we receive gifts that nurture body, mind, and spirit. Our offering is an opportunity to share some of what we have with the wider world. Even though we are unable to meet in person, we continue to take an online offering each week to support our community partners. For the month of July, our community partner is Self-Help Incorporated. Through grants and private and public contributions, Self-Help supports those who need help most during emergencies or in the quest to become economically self-sufficient. You can write a check payable to Self-Help and mail it to the address here on your screen and in the service notes below. The website address is also on your screen and can also be found below in the service notes. Please visit the site to learn more about Self-Help, and you can make your donation there as well. Thank you for your generosity. May what you give bring you joy.
We close with the words of Elizabeth Lerner Maclay. As drops of rain that find each other and build to become a track, a rivulet, a stream, a river, a sea, so are we drawn together. So are we fortunate to find each other. So are we bound together on this shared passage toward an unknown ocean and eternity. Amen.